A small-town teacher enters a world of wealth and privilege, feeling out of place at his son's high society wedding. Faced with judgment and dismissal, he must find a way to unite two very different worlds. Sometimes authenticity, humility, and wisdom are more powerful than a millionaire's wallet, and what he did shocked everyone. Don Miguel Ramirez sat at his worn kitchen table, the morning sun filtering through the lace curtains his late wife Elena had hung years ago. The warm light cast a gentle glow on the modest surroundings of their, now his, home in Millbrook, Ohio. His calloused fingers, testament to years of hard work, trembled slightly as he held a cream-colored envelope. With a deep breath, he carefully opened it, the scent of expensive perfume wafting up. So unlike the simple aromas that usually filled his home. He unfolded the invitation, his eyes widening as he read. Mr. and Mrs. Garcia cordially invite you to celebrate the wedding of their daughter, Sofia, to Alexander Ramirez. Don Miguel's gaze lingered on his son's name. Pride swelled in his chest, quickly followed by a pang of anxiety. New York City, the Plaza Hotel, names of people and places that seemed to belong to a different world, a world he had never been part of. He set the invitation down and walked to the living room, drawn to the photos on the mantel. There was Alex as a boy, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a science fair ribbon. Another showed him in his high school graduation gown, arm around Don Miguel and Elena. The most recent was from Alex's college graduation from NYU, the New York skyline gleaming behind them. Don Miguel picked up this last photo, his thumb gently brushing over Elena's smiling face. "Oh, mi amor," he whispered. "How I wish you were here to see our boy now." The shrill ring of the telephone startled him from his reverie. Setting down the photo, he shuffled back to the kitchen to answer. "Hola. Dad? Did you get it?" Alex's excited voice filled the line. "Sí, mijo, it arrived this morning," Don Miguel replied, trying to match his son's enthusiasm. "Isn't it great? The Garcias spared no expense. It's going to be amazing." Don Miguel lowered himself back into his chair, cradling the phone. "It looks very fancy, Alex. Are you sure they want me there? I don't know anything about big city weddings." There was a pause on the other end. When Alex spoke again, his voice was softer. "Dad, of course they want you there. You're my father. And don't worry about all the fancy stuff. Just be yourself. That's more than enough." Don Miguel nodded, forgetting for a moment that his son couldn't see him. "All right, mijo. If you say so." After they hung up, Don Miguel sat for a long while, staring at the invitation. The thought of being surrounded by New York's elite, in a place where a night's stay probably cost more than he made in a month as a high school Spanish teacher, made his stomach churn. But this was for Alex, his son, who had worked so hard, who had made a life for himself beyond their small town. Don Miguel knew he had to be there, had to find a way to fit into this world, if only for a weekend. With renewed determination, he stood and walked to his bedroom. Opening the closet, he pulled out the small suitcase he and Elena had used for their rare vacations. A fine layer of dust had settled on it, and he wiped it clean with a gentle hand. "Well, old friend," he said to the suitcase, "looks like we have another adventure ahead of us." The bus terminal in Columbus was a cacophony of sounds and movement, a stark contrast to the quiet streets of Millbrook. Don Miguel clutched his ticket, his small suitcase at his feet, as he watched the bustling crowd around him. Young backpackers, business people in crisp suits, families with excited children, all hurrying to their destinations. He felt out of place in his best tweed jacket and polished shoes, relics from his teaching days. A young woman with vibrant blue hair bumped into him, mumbling a quick apology before disappearing into the crowd. Don Miguel blinked, wondering not for the first time if he was making a mistake. "Now boarding, express service to New York City," the announcer's voice crackled over the speakers. Taking a deep breath, Don Miguel picked up his suitcase and joined the line of passengers. As he settled into his seat, he couldn't help but think of Elena. She had always been the adventurous one, dragging him on impromptu road trips and local explorations. "Life is too short to stay in one place, Miguel," she would say, her eyes twinkling with excitement. The bus lurched forward, and Don Miguel watched as the familiar landscapes of Ohio gave way to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. He dozed off somewhere in New Jersey, lulled by the hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the bus. He awoke with a start as the bus entered the Lincoln Tunnel. The darkness pressed in on all sides, broken only by the rhythmic flash of lights on the tunnel walls. Then suddenly, they emerged into a canyon of towering skyscrapers and honking taxis. New York City sprawled before him, a concrete jungle teeming with life. Don Miguel's eyes widened as he took in the dizzying heights of the buildings, the sea of people flooding the sidewalks, the flashing billboards that turned night into day. As the bus navigated through the busy streets, Don Miguel felt a growing sense of disorientation. How would he find his way in this maze of steel and glass? The thought of his small, quiet home in Millbrook seemed impossibly distant. Finally, the bus pulled into the Port Authority terminal. Don Miguel gathered his belongings and stepped out into the controlled chaos of the station. The noise was overwhelming. Announcements blaring, people shouting, the constant rumble of buses and trains. Following the crowd, he made his way to the street level, where the full sensory assault of New York hit him. The smell of street food mingled with exhaust fumes. The sidewalks thrummed with the energy of thousands of people, and the cacophony of car horns, music, and conversations in a dozen different languages filled the air. Don Miguel stood still for a moment, his suitcase in hand, feeling very small and lost. A friendly-looking hot dog vendor caught his eye and waved him over. "First time in the Big Apple, my friend?" the vendor asked, noting Don Miguel's wide-eyed expression. Don Miguel nodded, grateful for the human connection. "Is it that obvious?" The vendor laughed kindly. "Don't worry, everyone feels that way at first. Where you headed?" "The Plaza Hotel," Don Miguel replied, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. The vendor let out a low whistle. "Fancy digs. You want to grab a cab right over there," he said, pointing to a line of yellow taxis. Thanking the man, Don Miguel made his way to the taxi stand. As he settled into the back seat of a cab, he gave the driver the address, his voice barely audible over the city's din. As the taxi wove through the busy streets, Don Miguel watched the city unfold before him. The towering skyscrapers of Midtown gave way to the lush expanse of Central Park. And then, there it was, the Plaza Hotel, rising majestically at the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South. The taxi pulled up to the entrance, where uniformed doormen assisted guests and bellhops whisked away expensive luggage. Don Miguel stepped out, his small suitcase in hand, feeling more out of place than ever. Taking a deep breath, he reminded himself why he was here. For Alex. For family. With that thought bolstering his courage, Don Miguel squared his shoulders and walked through the grand entrance of the plaza, stepping into a world he had never known. The opulence of the plaza's lobby momentarily stunned Don Miguel. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over marble floors and gilded furnishings. Well-dressed guests milled about, their quiet conversations creating a gentle hum in the cavernous space. Clutching his worn suitcase, Don Miguel approached the front desk, acutely aware of his shabby tweed jacket and scuffed shoes. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to the plaza. How may I assist you?" The receptionist's polite smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she took in his appearance. "I'm here for the Garcia Ramirez wedding," Don Miguel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don Miguel Ramirez." Recognition flickered in the receptionist's eyes. Her smile became a touch warmer as she typed on her computer. "Ah yes, Mr. Ramirez. We have you in one of our Edwardian suites. Lucas will show you to your room." A young bellhop materialized at Don Miguel's side, reaching for his suitcase. "Oh no, that's fine," Don Miguel said hastily, clutching his bag. "I can carry it myself." Lucas nodded respectfully and led the way to the elevators. As they ascended, Don Miguel's stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hushed hallway, adorned with elegant sconces and plush carpeting. "Here we are, sir," Lucas said, opening the door to reveal a suite that was larger than Don Miguel's entire house back in Millbrook. Don Miguel stepped inside, awestruck by the ornate furnishings, the expansive windows overlooking Central Park, and the gleaming marble bathroom. It was beautiful, yet he felt more out of place than ever. "The rehearsal dinner is at 7 p.m. in the terrace room," Lucas informed him. "Will you need assistance with anything else, sir?" Don Miguel shook his head, pressing a small tip into the young man's hand. As the door closed behind Lucas, the silence of the room enveloped Don Miguel. He sat heavily on the edge of the plush bed, his mind whirling. A gentle knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. Opening it, he found himself face to face with his son. "Dad!" Alex exclaimed, pulling Don Miguel into a tight embrace. "I'm so glad you're here." Don Miguel held his son close, feeling some of his anxiety melt away. "Mijo, it's good to see you." Alex pulled back, his eyes shining with excitement. "Come on, I want you to meet Sophia's parents before the dinner." Nervousness crept back into Don Miguel's stomach as he followed Alex down the hall to another suite. Alex knocked, and the door was opened by a statuesque woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a string of pearls around her neck. "Alex, darling," she said, air-kissing both of Alex's cheeks before turning her gaze to Don Miguel. "And this must be your father." "Yes, Mrs. Garcia, this is my dad, Don Miguel Ramirez," Alex said proudly. "Dad, this is Sophia's mother, Constance Garcia." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Garcia," Don Miguel said, extending his hand. Constance looked at his hand for a moment before taking it in a brief, limp shake. "Charmed, I'm sure. Please, come in." The Garcia's suite made Don Miguel's look modest in comparison. Mr. Garcia, a distinguished-looking man with salt and pepper hair, was pouring drinks at a small bar in the corner. "Richard, darling, Alex and his father are here," Constance called out. Mr. Garcia approached, a forced smile on his face as he shook Don Miguel's hand. "Welcome to New York, Mr. Ramirez. I trust your journey was pleasant?" Don Miguel nodded, struggling to find his voice. "Yes, thank you. You have a lovely city." An awkward silence fell over the room. Don Miguel could feel the Garcia's eyes on him, assessing everything from his outdated clothes to his calloused hands. He had never felt so scrutinized in his life. "So, Mr. Ramirez," Constance said, breaking the silence. "Alex tells us you were a teacher?" "Yes, I taught Spanish at the high school in our town for over 30 years, Don Miguel replied, a note of pride in his voice. "How quaint," Constance said, exchanging a look with her husband. "I suppose that's where Alex got his interest in languages. Though I must say, we were surprised when he chose to pursue teaching instead of law or finance." Don Miguel felt a flare of defensiveness on behalf of his son and his own profession. "Teaching is a noble profession, Mrs. Garcia. It's about shaping minds and futures." Richard Garcia cleared his throat. "Yes, well, I'm sure it's very rewarding. Shall we head down to the rehearsal dinner? We don't want to keep the other guests waiting." As they left the suite, Don Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that he had already been found wanting in the Garcia's eyes. The weekend stretched before him, suddenly seeming very long indeed. The terrace room was a vision of elegance, with its crystal chandeliers and panoramic views of Central Park. Tables were adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces, and soft classical music played in the background. Don Miguel felt like he had stepped into a different world entirely. As Alex led him to their table, Don Miguel could feel the curious glances of the other guests. He heard whispers as they passed. "Is that Alex's father? I thought he'd be different. A high school teacher? How quaint." Don Miguel's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but he held his head high. He reminded himself that he was here for Alex, that his son was proud of him. At their table, they were joined by Sophia, radiant in a sleek cocktail dress, and a few other members of the wedding party. Don Miguel was relieved to see a familiar face, his colleague from Millbrook High, Sarah Johnson, who had made the trip for the wedding. "Miguel, it's so good to see you," Sarah said warmly, giving him a quick hug. "Isn't this place something else?" Don Miguel nodded, grateful for the friendly interaction. "It's certainly different from the staff parties in the school cafeteria," he joked, earning a laugh from Sarah and a smile from Alex. As the evening progressed, Don Miguel found himself struggling to keep up with the conversations around him. The other guests spoke of summer homes in the Hamptons, recent trips to Europe, and the latest exhibits at MoMA. He felt increasingly out of his depth. During a lull in the conversation, Constance Garcia leaned across the table towards Don Miguel. "Tell me, Mr. Ramirez, have you ever been to New York before?" "No, this is my first time," Don Miguel admitted. "Oh, how exciting for you," Constance said, her tone patronizing. "I'm sure it must be quite overwhelming. So different from your little town." Don Miguel felt his pride stir. "Millbrook may be small, Mrs. Garcia, but it has its own charms. We may not have skyscrapers, but we have a strong sense of community. Everyone knows their neighbors, helps each other out. It's where Alex learned the values that make him the man he is today." A hush fell over the table. Alex beamed at his father, while Sophia looked on with admiration. The Garcias, however, seemed taken aback by Don Miguel's sudden eloquence. Richard Garcia recovered first. "Well said, Mr. Ramirez. Perhaps you could tell us more about your town and your experiences as an educator." I'm sure it would be illuminating. As Don Miguel began to speak about his life in Millbrook and his years of teaching, he felt a shift in the atmosphere. Some guests leaned in, genuinely interested, while others looked on with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. Little did Don Miguel know, this was just the beginning of a weekend that would challenge his confidence, test his resolve, and ultimately, reveal the true wealth he had to offer. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the heavy curtains of Don Miguel's suite. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the awkward interactions from the rehearsal dinner the night before, the thinly veiled condescension from some of the guests, the pitying looks from others, and the constant feeling of being out of his depth had left him exhausted. As he stood before the ornate mirror, adjusting his rented tuxedo, Don Miguel couldn't help but think of Elena. She would have known exactly what to say to put him at ease, how to charm even the most judgmental of the Garcias' friends. A wave of loneliness washed over him as he fumbled with his bow tie. "Aye, Elena," he murmured to his reflection. "I wish you were here. You always knew how to make me feel like I belonged anywhere." A soft knock at the door interrupted his struggle. "Dad? Are you ready?" Alex's voice called from the hallway. Don Miguel opened the door to find his son, looking dashing in his own tuxedo, a nervous smile on his face. "Having trouble with the tie?" Alex asked, noticing his father's disheveled attempt. "Ah, mijo, you know I never got the hang of these things." Don Miguel chuckled softly, grateful for his son's presence. As Alex deftly tied the bow tie, Don Miguel studied his son's face. There was excitement there, yes, but also a hint of tension around his eyes. "Are you happy, Alex?" he asked quietly. Alex's hands stilled for a moment. "Of course, Dad. Why do you ask?" Don Miguel shrugged. "It's just this world, these people. They're so different from how we lived. I want to make sure this is truly what you want." Alex finished with the tie and placed his hands on his father's shoulders. "Dad, I love Sophia. Yes, her family is different from ours, but she's not like them. She sees the world the way we do. This fancy wedding, it's more for her parents than for us." Don Miguel nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "Your mother would be so proud of you, mijo. I know I am." Emotion flickered across Alex's face. "I wish she was here," he said softly. "She is, in her own way," Don Miguel replied, patting his son's cheek affectionately. "Now let's go get you married." The ceremony was held in the hotel's grand ballroom, transformed into a floral wonderland. Don Miguel sat in the front row, watching with misty eyes as his son stood at the altar. When Sophia appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in her gown, he saw the love that passed between her and Alex, and his remaining doubts melted away. As the couple exchanged vows, Don Miguel's mind drifted to his own wedding day. It had been a simple affair in the local church, followed by a reception in his parents' backyard. There had been no expensive flowers or gourmet catering, just homemade food and the joyful music of a local band. But the love, the sense of beginning a new adventure together, had been just as strong. The sound of applause brought Don Miguel back to the present. Alex and Sophia were walking back down the aisle, their faces glowing with happiness. For a moment, as they passed by, Sophia reached out and squeezed Don Miguel's hand, a gesture so warm and genuine that it brought tears to his eyes. As the guests began to file out for the cocktail hour, Don Miguel lingered in the ballroom, taking in the scene. He felt a presence beside him and turned to find Constance Garcia, her face an unreadable mask. "It was a beautiful ceremony, wasn't it?" she said, her voice carefully neutral. Don Miguel nodded. "Yes, very beautiful. Alex and Sophia, they look so happy together." Constance was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, Mr. Ramirez, I must admit I had my doubts about this union. Our families are so different." Don Miguel felt a flicker of the old discomfort, but he met Constance's gaze steadily. "Different, yes. But love, Mrs. Garcia. Love is universal. It doesn't care about bank accounts or social status." Something shifted in Constance's expression, a softening around the eyes. "No, I suppose it doesn't," she said quietly. Then, straightening her shoulders, she added, "Well, we should join the others. I believe you're seated at our table for the reception." The reception was in full swing, the terrace room of the plaza transformed into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. Don Miguel sat at the head table, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as the evening wore on. Despite the joy of the occasion, he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. The other guests, resplendent in designer gowns and custom-tailored suits, moved through the room with an ease born of familiarity with such lavish events. Don Miguel, in his rented tuxedo, felt like a fish out of water. As he sipped his champagne, he became acutely aware of the glances and whispers directed his way. A group of women at a nearby table kept looking over at him, their heads bent together in conversation. He caught fragments of their words. "Teacher from Ohio." "Can you imagine? How did Alex ever—" Don Miguel's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He had faced his share of challenges in life, but nothing had prepared him for this subtle, relentless scrutiny. He longed for the simplicity of his home in Millbrook, where people knew him for his character, not his bank account. "Are you enjoying yourself, Mr. Ramirez?" The voice belonged to Richard Garcia, who had appeared at Don Miguel's side with a fresh glass of champagne. "Oh yes, thank you," Don Miguel replied, trying to infuse his voice with enthusiasm he didn't feel. "It's a wonderful celebration." Richard nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Indeed, the Garcias have always known how to throw a party. I must say, it must be quite a change from what you're used to in—" "Where was it again?" "Millbrook," Don Miguel supplied, feeling a twinge of defensiveness. "It's a small town, but we have our own ways of celebrating. Perhaps not as grand, but just as meaningful." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sure," he said, in a tone that suggested he was anything but sure. "Well, do try to enjoy yourself. If you'll excuse me, I see some business associates I must greet." As Richard walked away, Don Miguel felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He watched as Alex and Sophia moved among the guests, accepting congratulations and posing for photos. They looked so happy, so at ease in this world that felt so foreign to him. Just as the feeling of alienation threatened to overwhelm him, he felt a gentle touch on his arm. It was Sophia, her face glowing with happiness. "Are you all right, Don Miguel?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. "You seem a bit overwhelmed." Don Miguel managed a small smile. "It's just very different from what I'm used to, my dear." Sophia squeezed his arm gently. "I know it can be a lot, but please remember, you're family now. Your presence here means the world to Alex, and to me." Her kindness, so genuine and unexpected, brought tears to Don Miguel's eyes. As Sophia was called away by another guest, Don Miguel took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He may not belong in this world of wealth and privilege, but he belonged here as Alex's father. And perhaps, he thought, it was time to show these people exactly what that meant. As the reception continued into the night, Don Miguel found himself retreating to a quiet corner of the terrace, seeking a moment of respite from the overwhelming opulence and thinly veiled judgment. The New York City skyline glittered before him, a stark contrast to the starry nights back home in Millbrook. He leaned against the railing, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stuffy ballroom. The thought of returning to face more condescending smiles and whispered comments made his stomach churn. For a brief moment, he considered leaving early, making an excuse about feeling unwell and retreating to the sanctuary of his hotel room. "It can be a bit much, can't it?" a gentle voice said behind him. Don Miguel turned to find an elderly woman standing there, her silver hair elegantly coiffed, a kind smile on her face. He recognized her as Sophia's grandmother, Eleanor Garcia. "Mrs. Garcia," he said, straightening up. "I was just getting some air. Please call me Eleanor," she said, moving to stand beside him at the railing. "And I don't blame you. These affairs can be terribly overwhelming, even for those of us who've been attending them for decades." Don Miguel nodded, surprised by her candor. "I must admit, I feel rather out of place," he confessed. Eleanor chuckled softly. "Would you like to know a secret, Don Miguel? Most of the people in there feel out of place too. They're just better at hiding it." He looked at her, skepticism clear on his face. Eleanor's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Oh yes, behind all the designer labels and practiced smiles, many of them are just as insecure, just as worried about fitting in. They're just playing a part they've been taught since childhood." Don Miguel considered her words, finding comfort in this unexpected moment of honesty. "I've been thinking of leaving early," he admitted. "I'm not sure I belong here." Eleanor's face grew serious. "Don Miguel, may I speak frankly?" At his nod, she continued, "You belong here more than most. You raised a son who is kind, intelligent, and true to himself. In my experience, that's worth more than any fortune or social standing." Her words struck a chord deep within Don Miguel, reminding him of why he was here. Not to impress the Garcias or their social circle, but to celebrate his son's happiness. "You know," Eleanor said, a mischievous glint in her eye, "I've always found that the best way to handle these situations is to be unapologetically yourself. These people respect authenticity, even if they rarely display it themselves." Don Miguel straightened his shoulders, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Eleanor. You've given me much to think about." She patted his arm gently. "Now, shall we return to the party? I believe they'll be serving dessert soon, and I have it on good authority that the cake is divine." The clinking of a spoon against a crystal glass cut through the chatter of the reception. All eyes turned to the front of the room where Richard Garcias stood, microphone in hand, ready to begin the toasts. Don Miguel felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach, knowing his turn would come soon. Richard's speech was polished and witty, peppered with anecdotes about Sophia's childhood and playful jabs at Alex's expense. The crowd laughed at all the right moments, and Don Miguel couldn't help but feel a twinge of inadequacy. How could his simple words compare to this? As Richard concluded to enthusiastic applause, the MC announced, "And now, we'll hear from the father of the groom, Don Miguel Ramirez." A hush fell over the room as Don Miguel stood, his hands trembling slightly as he made his way to the microphone. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, some curious, others skeptical. Taking a deep breath, he reminded himself of Eleanor's words and Alex's unwavering love. "Buenas noches," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "Good evening, everyone. I'm not much for public speaking, but for my son, I'll try my best." He paused, scanning the room. Alex and Sophia sat hand in hand, beaming up at him. In that moment, drawing strength from their happiness, Don Miguel felt something shift inside him. He straightened his shoulders and continued with renewed confidence. "You know, when Alex told me he was getting married, my first thought was of his mother, Elena. How proud she would be to see the man he's become." Don Miguel's voice cracked slightly with emotion. "She's not here with us today, but I know she's watching, probably telling me not to embarrass our son too much." A gentle ripple of laughter spread through the room, encouraging Don Miguel. "I've heard some whispers tonight," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "People wondering how a simple teacher from Ohio fits into all of this grandeur. The truth is I don't, but that's okay because I'm not here to fit in. I'm here to celebrate love, the love between my son and his beautiful bride, and the love that brought him into this world." He turned to face Alex and Sophia directly. "Mijo, your mother and I may not have been able to give you material wealth, but we gave you something far more valuable. We taught you the importance of kindness, of integrity, of finding joy in helping others. And looking at you now, I know we succeeded." Don Miguel's eyes swept across the room, meeting the gazes of those who had earlier dismissed him. Some might see teaching as a humble profession, but let me tell you something. Every day, I had the privilege of shaping young minds, of opening doors to new worlds through language and culture. And my son, he's carrying on that legacy, touching lives in ways that will ripple out for generations. He noticed a shift in the room. The earlier whispers had ceased, replaced by attentive silence. Even those who had seemed dismissive earlier were now listening intently. "To Alex and Sophia," Don Miguel continued, raising his glass, "may your love be as enduring as the lessons we pass down through generations. May you find wealth not in your bank accounts, but in the lives you touch and the difference you make in this world." As he concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite, measured clapping that had followed Richard's speech, but something more genuine, more heartfelt. Don Miguel saw tears in Sophia's eyes as she stood to embrace him, and felt Alex's strong arms wrap around them both. As he made his way back to his seat, Don Miguel noticed something had changed. The looks directed his way were no longer pitying or dismissive, but filled with a new respect. He had taken the stage not as an outsider trying to fit in, but as a man proud of his values and his son's choices. and in doing so, he had bridged a gap that had seemed insurmountable only hours before. As the night progressed, Don Miguel found himself approached by various guests, each eager to share a word or ask a question. The initial barrier of awkwardness had been broken down by his heartfelt speech, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. "Mr. Ramirez," a distinguished-looking man in his 60s said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Harrison, Dean of the Education Department at Columbia. I was deeply moved by your words about teaching. Would you mind sharing more about your experiences?" Don Miguel nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Of course, Dr. Harrison. You know, in my 30 years of teaching, I've learned that education is not just about imparting knowledge. It's about igniting a spark of curiosity that will burn for a lifetime." As he spoke, Don Miguel's mind drifted back to his classroom in Millbrook. He recalled a particular student, Maria, who had struggled with Spanish in her freshman year. "I had this student," he began, his eyes twinkling with the memory. "She was convinced she couldn't learn a new language. 'Mr. Ramirez,' she'd say, 'my tongue just doesn't work that way.' Dr. Harrison chuckled, nodding in recognition of a common student complaint. "But I didn't give up on her," Don Miguel continued. "I found ways to connect Spanish to her interests: music, fashion, food. By her senior year, Maria was not only fluent, but had decided to major in international relations in college." As he shared this story, Don Miguel noticed others had gathered around, listening intently. Among them was Richard Garcia, his earlier haughtiness replaced by genuine interest. "That's the real reward of teaching," Don Miguel said, his voice filled with passion. "Not just seeing a student master a subject, but watching them discover new possibilities for their lives." A young woman in the group, who Don Miguel recognized as one of Sophia's bridesmaids, spoke up. "But Mr. Ramirez, in today's world, isn't it more important to focus on subjects that lead to high-paying jobs, like STEM fields?" Don Miguel considered her question carefully. "Every field of study has its value," he replied. "But let me ask you this. What good is a brilliant scientist who can't communicate their ideas effectively, or a successful business person who can't understand the cultural nuances of a global market?" He paused, letting his words sink in. "Language, literature, history, these subjects teach us about the human experience. They foster empathy, critical thinking, and effective communication. These are skills that are valuable in every profession, in every aspect of life." Richard Garcia nodded slowly. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "I've always pushed for a focus on business and technology, but I see now there's more to consider." As the conversation continued, Don Miguel found himself sharing more stories from his years in the classroom. He spoke of the challenges, budget cuts, standardized testing pressures, students struggling with personal issues, but also of the triumphs, big and small. "I remember a boy, Tommy," Don Miguel said, his voice softening with the memory. "He was a troublemaker, always disrupting class. One day I asked him to stay after school. Instead of lecturing him, I asked him to help me plan our next cultural festival. The responsibility transformed him. He became one of my most enthusiastic students, and years later, he wrote to tell me he'd become a teacher himself." As he spoke, Don Miguel noticed a change in the faces around him. The polite interest had transformed into genuine engagement. Even those who had earlier dismissed him were now hanging on his every word. "You've given us much to think about, Mr. Ramirez," Dr. Harrison said, a note of admiration in his voice. "It's clear that your influence extends far beyond the classroom." Don Miguel shook his head humbly. "I'm just one teacher among many. Every day, educators are changing lives, opening minds, shaping the future. It may not be glamorous work, but it's vital." As the group dispersed, many thanking Don Miguel for his insights, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Alex, beaming with pride. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't think I've ever told you how much you inspired me to become a teacher. Watching you all these years, seeing the difference you made, that's what made me want to follow in your footsteps." Don Miguel pulled his son into a tight embrace, feeling a surge of love and pride. As they parted, he noticed Sophia and her parents approaching. Constance Garcia, her earlier reservations seemingly forgotten, smiled warmly. "Don Miguel, your words have given us a new perspective. We'd love to hear more about your teaching philosophy, perhaps over brunch tomorrow." As Don Miguel nodded in agreement, he realized that his simple words of wisdom had done more than just entertain the wedding guests. They had built a bridge between two worlds, fostering understanding and respect where there had once been judgment and division. In that moment, surrounded by new friends and family, Don Miguel felt a profound sense of belonging. He may have entered this glittering world as an outsider, but his authenticity and passion had carved out a place for him, proving that true wealth lies not in material possessions, but in the lives we touch and the wisdom we share. 6 months after the wedding, Don Miguel sat at his kitchen table in Millbrook, a letter from New York in his hands. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, just as it had on the day he received the wedding invitation, but so much had changed since then. As he unfolded the letter, the familiar scent of Sophia's perfume wafted up, bringing a smile to his face. He began to read, "Dear Dad, I hope this letter finds you well. Alex and I wanted to share some exciting news and extend an invitation. First, the Garcia Foundation has launched a new initiative inspired by your teachings. We're funding a program to bring cultural exchange and language learning opportunities to underprivileged schools across the country. Alex is heading the project, and he's thrilled to be putting your philosophies into action on a larger scale. Secondly, remember Diana Rothschild from the Library Foundation? Your speech at their fundraiser was a huge success. They've raised enough money to open 5 new bilingual reading rooms in underserved areas of the city. But here's the best part. The Garcias want to bring these initiatives to Millbrook. They're planning to use your hometown as a model for how these programs can transform small communities. We'd love for you to be part of the planning process. Which brings me to our invitation. We'd like you to come spend the holidays with us in New York. Both our families will be there, and we can't think of a better way to celebrate the changes your wisdom has inspired. With love, Sophia and Alex." Don Miguel set down the letter, his heart full. He thought about the wedding day, how he had felt so out of place, so unsure of his worth in that world of wealth and privilege. Now, 6 months later, he was being asked to help shape initiatives that could change lives across the country. As he looked out the window at the familiar streets of Millbrook, Don Miguel reflected on the power of staying true to oneself, of the ripple effects one person's authenticity could have. His simple wisdom, born from years of dedicated teaching and genuine care for others, had transcended social barriers and was now poised to make a difference on a scale he had never imagined. With a contented sigh, Don Miguel stood up, reaching for the phone. It was time to book his ticket to New York, to embrace this new chapter in his life's journey. As he dialed, he smiled, thinking of Elena. "You were right, mi amor," he whispered. "Life is too short to stay in one place. The adventure continues." What did you think of Don Miguel's attitude? Would you do the same? Please leave a comment with your opinion. 2 buttons will appear next to it, one to subscribe, if you haven't already, and another to watch other exciting stories. Make your choice. Thanks for watching this far. See you soon.